Hi. I got a tape I want to play.
Hello, and welcome to Sounding Cinema, where we explore the ways sound and music transform our relationship to film. My name is Nathan Platt. I teach music and film history at the University of Iowa. In this episode, I join Iowa students Luke Hine, Abbie McLaren, and Will Sinak to talk about the concert film. These films show musicians working their craft on stage, and they present a less common perspective on how film channels our attention to music, musicians, and musical performance. Our focus here is Talking Heads and their concert film, Stop Making Sense, which we'll get to in just a moment. Luke and Abbie will help set the stage now.
Although film has long been used to showcase performing musicians, the genre of feature-length concert film took hold in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The late 60s saw established documentarians venture into the music space with films such as D.A. Pennebaker's foundational 1967 film on Bob Dylan, titled Don't Look Back. Films were also made to document the large-scale music festivals of the late 60s and early 1970s. The booming music industry of the 1970s proved irresistible to Hollywood, and there began to be more concert films focusing on particular bands and aimed at their fans. Many of these were produced by record companies rather than film studios as a way to broaden artists' cultural reach. Some concert films sought to give audiences a sort of peek behind the curtain, offering behind-the-scenes footage and anecdotes about the musical artists. Other concert films attempted to recreate the live experience from the audience's perspective. This provided the ability to relive the concert, or for people who didn't have the opportunity to attend, it gave them the chance to experience it for the first time. In the 21st century, artists like Taylor Swift and Beyoncé have used concert films as tools to catapult their already gargantuan followings to even greater heights.
One of the most famous concert films, and what is widely considered one of, if not the greatest of all time, is Jonathan Demme's 1984 film Stop Making Sense, which captures the band Talking Heads at the height of their popularity, performing live at the Hollywood Pantages Theater. There are a lot of words that can be used to describe Talking Heads: new wave, art rock, funk, punk, post-punk, postmodern. Their eclectic, groovy sound is hard to pin down in words, but it can all be traced back to the art school sensibilities of vocalist David Byrne, drummer Chris France, and bassist Tina Weymouth. After a move to New York and the recruitment of guitarist and keyboardist Jerry Harrison, Talking Heads were off and running, releasing a debut record, partnering up with producer Brian Eno, and putting out a string of acclaimed albums. Stop Making Sense was filmed during the tour for the band's fifth album, Speaking in Tongues, which featured their only top 10 U.S. hit, Burning Down the House. The film is unique in its spotlighting of collaboration. Though the record was made by the original Talking Heads members, the band is joined by 5 additional musicians on stage who fit right into the lively conversational dynamic between band members. Though all the musicians are treated as worthy subjects of camera coverage, this is not to say there is no star. Byrne is clearly the ringleader of this musical circus, from his frontman character that presses play on a boombox, runs around the stage, and wears a big suit, to his behind-the-scenes creative contributions to the planning of the film's lighting and stage design. Stop Making Sense stands out from its peers in the genre as a concert film that embraces the artificiality of performance to an immersive effect, one that finds intimacy in the spectacle and seems to consider the experience of watching a concert film as not just a replacement for a ticket to the show, but an art all its own.
Okay, so let's start with what the film offers broadly. What stood out to you about Stop Making Sense as a cinematic concert experience?
Probably the first thing that I noticed when I was watching this and keeping in mind what my own experience going to concerts, the very few concert films I'd seen, is typically I've noticed that concert films are all about the trying to capture some semblance of the experience of what it's like to be there. That's kind of the whole point of a concert. The merit of going to a concert is you get this in-person experience, communal experience that is separate from anything you would get when you were just listening to their music or watching a music video of an artist or a band's work. And immediately when you start watching Stop Making Sense, it's not that type of film. There really isn't much, if any, thought given to capturing what it was like being there. It's a different type of story that they're telling. It's a very intentional story that both Jonathan Demme, the filmmaker, had in mind in collaboration with Talking Heads. And we can get into a little bit more, but it's the progression of the visuals and its relationship with the songs is very different than most other concert films that I've ever seen.
Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying, that I think Stop Making Sense places value on something different than a lot of other concert films do, I think, especially with relationship to the live experience. Well, I think a lot of other concert films that we may have seen, I might use like the recent Taylor Swift Eras tour film as an example, because I think a lot of people have seen that one. I think a lot of films like these feel like they're trying to offer maybe a seat in the house, a cheaper ticket with like a better view to make up for the fact that you're not actually there. It doesn't really feel like that's Stop Making Sense's goal, like to imitate this audience perspective. Like there's some other goal, there's some other value in there. We have shots taking place from the wings, from behind musicians, from the back of the house, all things that are not perspectives that you would have as an audience member. So there's something else going on, some kind of different goal. I think it's also important to note in relationship to all these other concert films that kind of offer the like seat in the house perspective, that a lot of those films are also offering some kind of background about the band, some kind of like behind the scenes feature. Maybe you see them like getting ready to go on stage or like interview footage interspersed, and Stop Making Sense doesn't have any of that. And I think that also points to this film having some kind of different value. I think in those concert films, those pieces function as like what you're getting in place of like not getting that live experience. They're like, for you to experience this fully, we're going to give you something a little bit extra because you're missing something, right? And this one isn't doing that. There's this kind of, I don't know, I think it points to Talking Heads' affinity for like artifice, and artifice being meaningful by itself and not having to, I don't know, make up something to like get you to that full experience.
It doesn't feel like, some of these, I don't want to reduce some concert films to just being another source of revenue, and here we're going to give all these other people that went to our concert in the first place, but and want to re-experience that. That's certainly a motivation, but it feels like this one's a lot more intentional as a work of art, and wanting to capture a perspective, and that seems to be in line with the ethos of Talking Heads.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to some of the specific like cinematic traits that kind of made this film stand out to me. I think there's a variety in the visual style that sort of allows each song to take on its own life within the film. There's a super long take in Once in a Lifetime of just David Byrne, but then other songs really focus on kind of the relationships between band members. And there's just a lot of building of like different shots that create sort of different narratives about what this band is doing throughout the film. And I don't think you see a lot of that variety. I mean, there's variety in many concert films, but the range of stylistic choices that we see like in the camera work was surprising to me. Is there anything else you guys thought of like within the way it was shot that like stood out or made it feel different?
I agree with what both of you have been saying, in the sense that it sets itself apart from the get-go, from being something that is meant to simulate a live in-person experience. I was particularly interested in the way that it started and how close and limited the view was of just somebody walking up to the stage and placing a boombox, and we hear David Byrne saying something along the lines of, "I've got some tapes I'd like you to listen to," or something. I know that wasn't the
I've got a tape I want to play.
Yeah. Yes. And so that from the get-go visually and narratively kind of set itself up for something much different than here is a professional recording of a concert or here is a tour film.
Yeah, there's something going on with this tension or just contrast between the like really, really clear structuring, right? Of, first David Byrne comes out with the boombox. And again, this just reminds me of like a school talent show where he just sets it up and starts playing it and starts dancing around and singing to it. And then with each, successive song, of course, more band members are sort of brought on and more equipment is brought on. So there's this really clear sort of trajectory and just sense of like, we have planned this out very, very carefully, and we want you to be aware of that planning. We're like going to sort of show you how that's unfolding. So like equipment is being brought in while a song is still like playing, like the setup for the next song is being put in place while the previous song is still being finished, which feels very strange, but starts to kind of like take on a certain logic within the film. But then there are so many other elements that seem to kind of like work against that, or maybe not work against, but complement that structure, which is kind of like the actions of the band members themselves.
Yeah, also to speak on the way the band members are kind of visually introduced in that way, I think it also presents an interesting relationship between the film and its audience, and that a lot of times when you go to watch a concert film, you're watching it because you're a fan of the band. And I think this film is sort of built up in a way where you don't need to be a fan of the band, because you sort of get your hand held, you get kind of walked into, you meet all the characters individually. I saw this film without being a fan of the Talking Heads beforehand. I thought I was seeing a different film for some reason, and then I ended up seeing Stop Making Sense. But I didn't know a lot of their music, and I feel like I was really introduced in a very like slow but like all-encompassing way, and that I really get walked into it. And it feels like we don't need to know the band beforehand, and maybe that we're not even meant to. Like maybe this is meant for people that obviously it's going to be enjoyed by fans of Talking Heads, but maybe it's also meant to be a bridge to people who aren't already fans of their music.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think maybe uniquely all four of us didn't have much, if any, of a relationship to the Talking Heads before we saw this film, which is quite interesting. And Professor Platt, as you were talking about, there's almost like a narrative through line that really helps this work as the film builds and we see the band grow, and they're changing all these aspects, and as you're kind of carried through the film as well, as you were saying, Abbie, it really almost kind of holds your hand through it and introduces you to the band, to their musical style, to everything as you're going through without needing to have any type of prior information or prior relationship to this band. And it's part of what makes this such an effective concert film to me. There's some musical artists or some bands that they'll just get up there and they'll play their music, and if you're a fan of their music, then you're going to love that concert. Some are very intentional about creating a story, and this is one where I think the songs aren't necessarily connected narratively, but you can follow what's happening because there is that through line, and it's what makes it so effective as a film. And if we want to talk about it now, I think another part is David Byrne as a lead man also helps us, and he perfectly assumes that role of a protagonist like we would see in any other film. And I think it'd be a fine time to talk about that now as another reason why this kind of narrative structure works in this film.
How do you know?
obviously as the lead singer of a band, he's so integral to what's happening, but his performance, his persona kind of permeates through all kinds of different aspects of this film and the talking heads and the music, even more so than just a lead vocalist. Something that really struck me the first time I watched this film was how charismatic and how he almost assumed different roles depending on the song. It's the complete opposite of what I was talking about, where he's not just up there singing his music. He's not just wailing on songs and letting his talent, like you might see a different performer do. He is intentionally thinking about it. He's playing a character almost. I mean, he's being authentic to himself, and he changes it from song to song, which I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, I think we would be remiss not to talk about his physical performance, because when you look at him on screen, when he dances, when he moves, he doesn't look like every other, lead man you've seen singing in front of a band, right? He moves weird. His face has weird expressions. His eyes get really big. Like, he's being someone that you're not used to seeing, and I think that's very visually interesting, and it really captures you, especially when, like you said, Luke, he is like changing it throughout. He changes his look multiple times. He has costume changes, obviously. The big suit is very well known as this kind of, another example of something you've seen before, but not the way you've seen it before. We've all seen a suit. We've all seen a guy dancing in a suit on stage, right? But we haven't seen it in this, the way it contrasts with how he's a very skinny man, right? And we see this huge suit just enveloping him. And I don't know, I think there's all this like physicality to his performance that's very interesting. He kind of wiggles his arms, like he kind of dances like a child, right? So I agree that that's really like a captivating force that makes you stay in it.
I started writing down quotes from film critics and music critics who were writing about the film, and there was always something that was just be about him, which makes sense because like we were saying, he's kind of the protagonist. He's also, to a certain extent, kind of like a writer or co-director. He storyboarded a lot of the, what the sort of overarching sort of like what the numbers look like. But this is from the Variety reviewer. Intense, severe in looks, and vocally limited, he indulges in considerable spastic dancing, and his trademark movement, with head bobbing back and forth, resembles that of an ostrich. But he can also boogie with the best of them, and he emerges as a compelling, if remote, personality. And then I also really liked this. This was from Tracy Young writing for Vogue. As gaunt and haunted-looking as Tony Perkins in his salad days, and that's Norman Bates from Psycho, if you're wondering who Tony Perkins is. David Byrne can transform himself from a lounge lizard to killer nerd just by changing the way he parts his hair. You can tell like the critics are just so excited for the opportunity to even like try to describe like what they're seeing for a readership. Again, it kind of comes back to that sort of balancing of something that seems very, very planned and very choreographed with something that kind of surprises people and they're not quite sure like how to process it, basically.
It's like a planned randomness. Talking Heads and Byrne and this film are really inviting its audience, inviting us to ask questions. It's on the back of the CD. It's on the letterboxed handle. They're inviting us to ask why. Why is this happening? Why in this time? Why a big suit? Why a lamp on stage? And they want it to be different. They want it to have a kind of the illusion of spontaneity or something is what we talked about it. And when we can talk about that later. And that's so in line with who Byrne is. And it's so interesting, especially when you're watching a film it's simply people singing songs. But these questions that they want you to think about make it such a better experience than if you're just enjoying and bopping along to the songs, which is also a way that you can enjoy this if you're a huge fan and they're good. It's good music, you can just bop along to them, but you can also think about the those aspects that they invite you to think about as well.
I like the idea that you seem to kind of just bring up, which is that it has like different layers of accessibility. I think from a viewer's perspective, where personally my first time watching this, one of my friends from the get-go just kind of wanted to get up and dance. And watching the second time through by myself, I was picking up on a much different viewing experience because it is something that can be taken as maybe a lot of other concert films tend to operate as, which is just an accompaniment to an experience we might encounter if we physically attend one of these. But it can go from that to, no, we're providing you something much deeper than an audience member that night at this recording may have experienced.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how you sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, Abbie, that there's a lot that this film doesn't give us that we would expect in a concert film. And that was also something that I was really struck by. All the reviews from the 80s that I read, everybody talked about what this film did not have and how that was a good thing. Like that it didn't have the backstage chatter, that it didn't have the kind of like obligatory shots of the audience, things that people have also noted. I mean, like we don't have voiceover, we don't have titles, and those absences actually create more space for a kind of more visceral, just sort of connection with this group. And I do think it's a great introduction to them and is sort of set up that way so that, yeah, even if you don't know the band at all, you feel like you're getting to know them, even though there's never a kind of like, let's introduce everybody right now. Or actually, I guess they do. They do that at the very end, right?
But not until the end.
Not until the end. But yeah, in any case, it's an interesting approach that something, I don't know, just something about that sort of less is more, I guess, is kind of working underneath this.
I also think that sort of leaving out of these like behind the scenes, more traditional documentary pieces is really interesting in a today standpoint. I feel like artist-fan relationships are so like parasocial now, and that fans would just be clamoring for those kinds of, insights into an artist's life. And I think this film really takes a stance as like, there's a line here and there's like value in having that distance. Yeah, I think it just stands out to me a lot in contrast to, I don't know, the way people interact with artists they enjoy. And I think it's really something unique, maybe even more so in our modern concert film landscape than even in the 80s.
The word that comes to mind that is like so expected now is authentic, right? Like we expect our artists to be authentic, and that means that we sort of know who they really are. And these are all so clearly personas. Like I don't expect that any of these people, quote, really act like this the rest of the time. But because of that, it feels like there's something really sort of special there. It can still be meaningful, maybe even more meaningful, but it's not a sort of like, here I am, this is who I truly am, and I'm giving it to my fans, right?
Authenticity is a whole can of worms, but
yes, it is.
I do think there's like a confidence about the artistry in this film and the performance that these can be sort of the sole drivers of the product, and you don't need to offer these other things, and you don't need to pander to authenticity in order for it to stand on its own.
It's not quite like anything else. It almost feels like a stage show a little bit, where like they're putting on a show that they're almost like characters that were almost removed. The audience is removed from it, but we get to see the show play out, and it's paced not quite like a concert is, in my experience. It's paced not at all like a concert film or a documentary is paced. It's paced like a TV show or a film in many ways. It doesn't really stop. There's only brief pauses, and I don't know if in the actual show if there were pauses. There's like a 2-minute break when the band resets. There's hardly any talking in between pieces. It's just song after song, and it really moves like a show to me.
I did pick up on a lot of mannerisms of a Broadway production or a general theater show while watching this because of, like you said, things like the breaks between songs reminded me a lot less of space in between songs at a concert and more of the stage resetting in between songs in a Broadway performance or something. I think that added a lot to the experience between the viewer and the performers, to me at least. I think this was also brought up a bit, that the actual audience that was in attendance seems to be put to the side a little bit. We are aware that they're there from a few shots, but that's not what is ever the focus. That layer has been removed And I think that that layer is very instrumental in a lot of other concert films.
And it feels like a scene change because they are scene changes. We're watching it play out. We were watching new members be added, a drum set come on, and other percussive instruments come on stage. The background changes at a certain point. A backdrop actually comes down. The lighting changes. Byrne has costume changes, character changes. So in that way, it feels very dynamic.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
In most feature films, music influences our relationship to characters and story. Now, in concert films, this often gets flipped. The film's visuals shape our relationship to the musicians and our attention to the musical sounds themselves. What are some examples of where this influence stood out to you?
I think a really cool aspect about this film is how the camera, or I guess as we're watching it, it has a different perspective where what we see visually influences what we hear as well. And I think a great example of that, it's pretty subtle, but a great example of that is during the song Slippery People, the camera pans over to Lynn Mabry and Edna Holt, who are they're harmonizing, and you hear that louder and clearer than you would a typical background singer. It seemed apparent to me, at least, that they were boosted in some way, and that because the camera was focusing on them, there was a want to hear more of what they were singing. So you hear their parts relative to Byrne a lot louder than when the camera is following Byrne.
What's the matter with him? How do you know? Don't know no way. Love from the bottom to the top. Turn like a wheel and see for yourself. We're gonna move. Turn like a wheel inside a wheel.
I love that part because I think it sort of reverses or overturns like what we think of, like when we think of backup, right? Of a backup singer means like you're often physically behind the singer, or lower in the mix, or both, some combination thereof. And in this sequence, Lynn and Edna, who are sort of cast and sort of like, well, they're backup singers because they are not the lead singers, and they are reinforcing Byrne's voice on the chorus and stuff, and then also doing some call and response with him. The camera really focuses on them a lot, and so even sometimes focusing on them while he is singing, which is kind of cuts counter to what we would normally expect, right? Like the camera would be where whoever is kind of making the most important vocal contribution is. And I just thought that was a really neat touch, which kind of, reminds us again of like how this is a shared endeavor. And even though David Byrne is our lead in this, there's a clear decision to like make sure that some of these other parts of the experience are really, really featured in a way that kind of almost runs counter to what we would sort of expect in traditional editing.
And I do think it is edited in that way as well, but there's also kind of an implicit thing happening as well that even if it isn't, I mean, I think it is actually boosted, but there's also parts where the camera will pan to other members of the band, like the percussion, and it'll stay with them for a while, and you'll see it happening, and then that implicitly it draws your attention to different aspects of the musical mix and what's happening on stage. You think as you see I can't remember his name, but the one hammering on the bongos or whatever the alternate.
Yeah, Steve Scales.
Yes, as Steve Scales is rocking away on his percussion, you're automatically drawn to thinking about his part and how it fits into the piece as well, which I think is a really cool relationship to rather than just parking a camera on David Byrne or parking a camera in the back of the audience where you see it all as a whole. You get to kind of dissect each piece, and people who are maybe more interested in the musical aspects and diving into like the counterpoint behind it or whatever it may be can listen and hear for those types of things, and the camera invites you to do that.
I do actually think what you were saying earlier, Professor Platt, about how in feature films, music influences our relationship to characters, particularly about how they're shot and edited and kind of ultimately made to look in the image track. I do often think that is the case in concert films, and something that I think happens, especially when we're thinking about editing and the way the images are kind of arranged in accordance to what the music is doing rather than what the performer might be physically doing. I would call that like music video editing. I think a lot of like cutting on beats where an image track is responding to an audio track rather than the other way around, or rather than kind of working in tandem. I think Stop Making Sense kind of stands out to me in this way. It feels kind of fairly unique in the importance that it gives to the image track within the concert film genre specifically. I don't know that I would say the music track is responding to the image track, but I kind of feel like they seem to be working in conjunction more than the image responding to the audio that I feel like I've seen in a lot of concert films, especially like you guys were saying when we see other musicians playing while David Byrne is singing, because that feels kind of unusual.
It certainly seems like they're working in tandem together and serving each other in a way that's more in equal parts than you would see in a traditional film or a traditional concert.
Yeah, I think because of that, I think there was a few examples in the film where they did kind of lean into that music video editing, that kind of responding image to music that really stood out to me. And I think they used it in really specific places. When I was watching this film, the most recent time I watched it, I tried to keep track of examples where this happened and see if there was any patterns. And I felt like a lot of times that they ended up doing cross-cutting, cutting back and forth between two specific musicians was at times when there was like a musical conversation kind of going on, a back and forth between the instruments where maybe one is kind of mimicking the other, kind of response, call and response. In Slippery People, there's an example of cross-cutting between Edna and Lynn and David Byrne vocally. Also in What a Day That Was, this happens instrumentally between guitar and synth, cross-cutting between those two musicians. And yeah, I thought those were interesting moments to choose to use that editing method because it really emphasizes the fact that this is a band and not a solo. Like, even though David Byrne is clearly our lead, it's very much a collaborative effort, and all these instances of this kind of tropey editing really go to serve that kind of communal purpose.
I like the idea that the editing is bringing another layer to sort of like the music's meaning beyond just the sounds themselves. It's more sort of like relational, and that can tap into sounds like what you were saying, Luke, with when it starts with Steve Scales playing bongos. Like, we hear the bongos and we notice them even after the camera moves away from him, but it can also apply to things that we maybe it's kind of subjective to say how much it affects what we are hearing, but it's affecting the significance that we're ascribing to the sounds that we're hearing based on, like you were saying, Abbie, these conversations that can happen across voices or across instruments. And it's really interesting to me to kind of like, I've been going back and forth between listening to the album of the film and then watching the film, and there's so many different ways in which these songs sound just based on kind of like where your attention is being guided. And so obviously the image track can play a really interesting role in that, but sometimes not in ways that feel straightforward.
I also think it's interesting why this film, it also feels separate from their music. I know Talking Heads were frequent collaborators with other artists, but they're technically just the four people. But this film is maybe one of the most defining moments of the band's existence, and it's a collaboration of a ton of people. And so the sound is a lot different with all these people working with them than you would get on the studio album, and it's its own thing, and the camera can draw attention to how those things differ from each other as well.
Maybe you've talked too much about Slippery People, but it is a really good example of that because, okay, going back to the bongos. The bongos are technically in the studio track, but they're really quiet. And to be honest with you, I didn't even notice they were there until I went back to the studio track and tried to hear them. And I was like, oh yeah, they're there, but it's a simpler rhythm and it's much, much lower in the mix. And there's a lot of other things that are different as well. The studio track is just a few beats slower, and that really changes the groove as well and stuff. At any rate, it's neat to kind of be able to compare the two. And obviously, I think we would expect them to be different. It shouldn't be like a shocker that they're different. But what's interesting is like I encountered one of these as through sound, and the other one I encountered through film, and that has really affected like what I think I'm hearing, because I've got not just visuals, I've got a very sort of like curated visual journey through this song.
It really pushed the idea to me further that they were going for something that was much more of a unique experience than what is heard on those studio tracks.
Yeah, I think that journey of listening to a lot more Talking Heads studio tracks after having seen the film is something I kind of experienced a few months after I first saw the film. I listened to all the Talking Heads albums while I was working on a project, so back to back, effectively. And one thing that I noticed when I was doing that is that Found a Job in Stop Making Sense is missing a verse. They don't perform the entire song, which I thought was really interesting. And it really it changed my reading of the song. It was almost like a more sentimental verse, I think, that they kind of leave out about if your work isn't what you love, then something isn't right. I think that's a lyric that's in the studio track that's not in the Stop Making Sense track. And it's like a lot more earnest.
So think about this little scene, apply it to your life. If your work isn't what you love, then something isn't right.
It was really interesting to me that they chose to leave that out of the performed version. I think it takes the song to like a more kind of personal level and sort of removes some of that artifice. You're kind of talking obviously second person directly to the audience, which they do in other songs, but like that transition, I think in Found a Job feels a little bit more personal, and I think removing it from the film was, it's a decision I just think a lot about what that meant. And it was interesting to kind of track that change from having seen the film first and then hearing the original version.
Yeah. I wonder about kind of if you have any thoughts about that in relationship to Once in a Lifetime, just because I think you mentioned earlier that that's the one that has, just this very, very long take. Like it's pretty much just David Byrne. And it's a sort of a curious song because the verses are sort of spoken, kind of like almost like preached, sort of.
You may find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile. You may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife. You may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down.
At any rate, it's just kind of a curious blend of vocal modalities, and the camera just hangs out for so long.
I think, again, with the second person lyrics in Once in a Lifetime could point a lot to what's going on there. I definitely agree that it sounds like a preacher, like a sermon. Byrne is also doing things with his hands there that are kind of like evangelical, like televangelist kind of preacher motions, in my reading of it at least. And I do think that the long take kind of adds to that notion of, I don't know, sort of like narrowing your perspective on one person feels akin to religion in some way, I think. And then I was also interested in where the film finally does break away from the long take.
It's a really interesting moment because I think it's like when he's like kind of like arched his back, right? Like he's like sort of done that weird like sort of like bending way over backwards, and then it kind of like cuts away from him as he's sort of coming upright again, and we realize that the backup singers have also been doing that too, but you didn't know that because you couldn't see them.
It's the part where he says like time isn't holding us, time isn't after us, which I think it's really interesting to cut and start manipulating time at that point where you start talking about time in the song.
Time isn't holding us, time isn't after us, time isn't holding us, time isn't
this idea that you've been locked into this one like temporal like piece, this one like ongoing shot that is like a certain length, and the point where you break that up is the point where you're saying the words time isn't holding us, time isn't after us. Like there's this freedom to not be so locked into that temporal mode.
Time isn't after us. Time isn't holding us. Give it back. Give it back. Letting the days go by. Letting the days go by. Letting the days go by.
So, more than 40 years after its premiere, what does Stop Making Sense offer us today?
Well, I think at a very basic level, it's a different and inviting entry point for people who are interested in getting into talking heads or have any interest in concert films. It's kind of lived on as one of, if not the most defining concert films of all time. And it's also a great look at this band at kind of the height of their powers. It certainly has become that for me. I don't think I'll become a huge Talking Heads stan or anything because of it, but it was a band I didn't have exposure to before, even though I knew about them. I had heard some of their music, but it's a band I'd like to visit more of their music. This film in 2023, it got re-released by A24, so I think that was a pretty cool event where similar to me, a lot of people gained exposure to Talking Heads and were able to find that entry point. And I think it'll just live on as that.
Unlike you, Luke, I think I did become quite a big Talking Heads fan after seeing Stop Making Sense. I think they were my number 6 artist last year, if I remember correctly. So they got up there.
And that's not uncommon, as I understand it. So
no, I don't think so. Many of my friends who also saw the film for the first time within the past year have also become pretty big Talking Heads fans. And I don't know if this is directly an answer to the question that was posed, but it's been something I've been thinking a lot about, and it's the question of if I would rather have seen this show live in the room, or if I like it, or choose to watch the film. Like if I had to choose between seeing the concert live and watching the film, which one would I choose? And I went back and forth on this a little bit, but I think ultimately if I had to choose, I would still rather see this live in the room, but only because of the significance that the film has grown to have for me, having seen it several times. I think if I chose to see it live in the room, the value for me is being sort of at that moment where this film was made, not necessarily seeing this performance, even though it is an amazing performance. I think often the value of a concert film lies in bearing witness to the moment of artistry that's happening right there. And I think that's still kind of true, but it's just a different piece of where that artistry is happening, right? I would want to be bearing witness to the film being made. And obviously the concert being performed is a part of that, but it's twisting it in a little way. And I think both things are true, but the value that I place on this film in comparison to its related live experience is maybe more equal than those two pieces would be if it was a different concert film.
That's a really good point. It's a question I've been thinking about as well. What are the merits of a concert film? And frankly, most concert films just don't work for me. I think I've been to a number of concerts in my life, and they're very fond memories, and I don't think it's really something you can replicate, which is a goal of a lot of, or a seeming goal of a lot of concert films. And this one, as we've talked about, is doing something different, and it works as a film outside of the concert. At least it does to me. So it's just fascinating to me as someone who has seen a couple concert films and almost none of them have worked, that I did enjoy this one. And I agree. I would also rather be in there experiencing it live. But I think the filmmaking and the differentness of Stop Making Sense gives it a lot more merit, and I think will continue. I think I would hope, actually, even though this is an old film, not super old, but I haven't really seen many concert films try to replicate this, but it's something that I'd be really interested in seeing if it had more of an impact. Maybe there will be some kind of a revival of this style of filmmaking.
Going off of that, one thing that stood out to me was when this question was introduced, the fact that it was 40 years ago really made me think, because it doesn't feel dated to me in any way, and it doesn't feel like it has a timestamp on it. And a lot of performances from decades ago, things that come to my mind like Live Aid and things like that, seem to be defined by the year that they were in or an era that they were surrounded by. And this, I know the word timeless can get thrown around, but this feels like, especially considering its re-release and its kind of re-emergence into discussions today, I would say that in my opinion, it's earned that title as being a very timeless film and a youthful film to me. And it is something that came out years before Luke, Abbie, or I were around, in the fact that we're able to have such relevant discussions about it today, and the fact that we can look around and look at other concert films as we've discussed in this and say nobody's really been able seemingly to replicate quite what was done with Stop Making Sense. And I think there's definitely something to be said about that.
Yeah, I feel like your point about how, that it's aged well is just so true. And I think some of that is the durability of the music, but a lot of it I feel like there's just something really neat about seeing this group of musicians together. It's mixed gender, it's interracial, they have such like clear rapport like with each other, and when they're dancing, it doesn't have a kind of like overproduced look. It looks like they're still just kind of like dancing because it's fun to dance. It's a little unstudied. And a lot of their dancing is like mirror dancing, where like David Byrne is playing guitar and rocking back and forth. So Mabray and Holt are like playing air guitar back at him and stuff. I mean, that kind of thing is just like so charming and just so cool. And then the sort of flip of the fun part is that like you also really see how much work it takes. Like everybody is visibly sweating, and they don't try to hide that at all. And I love that we see the stage people also, like we see their work. We see them wheeling things out. The Girlfriend is Better. They're using these like mobile spotlights. David Byrne calls them sun guns. Is that a technical term?
I've never heard that term,
Okay.
but yeah, you do have the crew member holding the light walking right in front of him.
So it should be a technical term now.
Right.
It's probably real. I probably just haven't heard of it.
I don't
trust
know.
David Byrne.
It just rocks either
If
way.
David says so.
Yeah, but like, so we see the person with the spotlight walking among the band members and stuff, and actually like for the title lyric for Stop Making Sense, David Byrne like shoves the microphone at the face of the guy who's holding the spotlight, and he says he says the title, and then he shoves the microphone at in the direction of the camera, the person who's holding the camera that we're watching him through. And so like I really just love that it's kind of like recording all of that as opposed to trying to sort of like hide it. I think that's just really neat to see, but it also feels it feels cinematic in the kind of documentary cinematic kind of way of like we're actually sort of trying to sort of capture this particular experience, and we're not trying to kind of overproduce it or make it too precious. It feels a little bit more free and exciting.
I would just say this is not a video podcast, but if anyone were to watch any part of the film, I think that moment you were talking about where Byrne is singing Stop Making Sense over and over, and he offers the microphone to the crew member and towards the camera, is maybe the moment that visually represents the ethos of the entire film the best, and I think it's worth watching.
I would just say I think this film is transportative in a way that you just don't get anymore. I mean, we live in a time where the entire like Taylor Swift Eras tour, and I'm not even talking about the film, I'm talking about the actual tour, was live streamed on Twitter
TikTok.
or on TikTok. And if you want to see basically anything of any artist, you can. There's so much video, there's so much content that's placed out about them. That's not to say there wasn't a ton of things, literature about the Talking Heads and reviews and whatnot, and scholarly work done about them. But it's just, to me, it's different that this film really puts you in this moment in time with this band, and it in this performance that's so transportative, instead of just firing up YouTube and seeing all this content that you can see nowadays.
As we get older and start making sense, you won't find a way to know. Stop making sense. Stop making sense. Stop making sense. Making sense. I gotta go.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sounding Cinema. To support the conversation, this episode included brief audio clips from several Talking Heads albums. There were, of course, excerpts from the film Stop Making Sense, and snippets of the studio album version of Slippery People from Speaking in Tongues. We also heard a bit of that last verse from Found a Job on the album More Songs About Buildings and Food. Special thank you to Jean-Francois Charles, a composition professor at the University of Iowa who loaned us space for recording this episode. I also want to give a hearty note of thanks to the student team here, Luke Hyen, Abbie McLaren, and Will Sinak. You, of course, heard them in this episode's conversation, but they also worked collaboratively in writing the intros for the episode and editing the discussion after we had recorded it. It was wonderful to work with these 3 Iowa seniors on this episode, as well as the earlier episode on Mark Rebo's music for Alita, Queen of Mars. They were a great team, and I had a blast talking with them about movies and planning these episodes together. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please give us a review on your preferred platform and subscribe so that you'll know when our next episode drops. Until then, happy listening.